All right, all right. Welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. We're on chapter 9, Germany from Kaiser to Hitler, 1913 to 1945. Okay, so introduction. The Weimar Republic, 1918 to 1933. The Nazi regime, coming to power, 1933 to 1934. And then rulers and the ruled, 1934 to 1945. All right. Introduction. Oops. The fate of Germany is one of the most tragic in all human history, for seldom has a people of such talent and accomplishment brought such disasters on themselves and on others. The explanation of how Germany came to such straits cannot be found by examining the history of the 20th century alone. Germany came to the disaster of 1945 by a path whose beginnings lie in the distant past, in the whole pattern of German history from the days of the Germanic tribes to the present. That Germany had a tribal and not civilized origin and was outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire and of the Latin language were two of the factors which led Germany ultimately to 1945. The Germanic tribe gave security and meaning to each individual's life to a degree where it almost absorbed the individual in the group, as tribes usually do. It gave security because it protected the individual in a social status of known and relatively stable social relationships with his fellows. It gave meaning because it was all-absorbing, totalitarian, if you will, in that it satisfied almost all an individual's needs in a single system. The shattering of the Germanic tribe in the period of the migrations, 1,500 years ago, and the exposure of its members to a higher but equally total and equally satisfying social structure, the Roman imperial system, and the subsequent, almost immediately subsequent, shattering of that Roman system caused a double trauma from which the Germans have not recovered even today. The shattering of the tribe left the individual German, as a similar experience today has left many Africans, in a chaos of unfamiliar experiences in which there was neither security nor meaning. When all other relationships had been destroyed, the German was left with only one human relationship on which he turned all his energy, loyalty to his immediate companions. But this could not carry all his life's energy or satisfy all of life's needs. No single human relationship can ever, and the effort to make it do so can only turn into a monstrosity. But the German tribesmen of the 6th century, when all else was shattered, made such an effort and tried to build all security and all meaning on personal loyalty. Any violence, any criminal act, any bestiality was justified for the sake of the allegiance of personal loyalty. The result is to be seen in the earliest work of Germanic literature, the Nibelungenlied, a madhouse dominated by this one mood, in a situation not totally unlike the Germany of 1945. In the insanity of monomania created by the shattering of the Germanic tribes came the sudden recognition of a better system, which could be, they thought, equally secure, equally meaningful, because equally total. This was symbolized by the word Rome. It is almost impossible for us, of the West and of today, imbued as we are with historical perspective and individualism, to see what classical culture was like and why it appealed to the Germans. Both may be summed up in the word total. The Greek polis, like the Roman imperium, was total. We in the West have escaped the fascination of totalitarianism because we have in our tradition other elements: the refusal of the Hebrews to confuse God with the world or religion with the state, and the realization that God is transcendental and accordingly all other things must be, in some degree, incomplete and thus imperfect. We also have, in our tradition, Christ, who stood apart from the state and told his followers to render to Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and we have in our tradition the Church of the Catacombs, where clearly human values were neither united nor total and were opposed to the state. The Germans, as later the Russians, escaped the full influence of these elements in the tradition of the West. The Germans and the Russians knew Rome only in its post-Constantine phase, when the Christian emperors were seeking to preserve the totalitarian system of Diocletian, but in a Christian rather than pagan totalitarianism. This was the system the detribalized Germans glimpsed just before it was also shattered. They saw it as a greater, larger, more powerful entity than the tribe, but with the same elements which they wanted to preserve from their tribal past. They yearned to become part of that imperial totalitarianism. They still yearn for it. Theodoric, the Ostrogoth Roman emperor, 489 to 526, I guess that's BC, or it could be AD, I'm not sure, I guess. Yeah, it would be AD if it's after Constantine. Okay. Saw himself as a Germanic Constantine. The Germans continued their refusal to accept this second loss, as the Latins and the Celts were prepared to do. And for the next 1,000 years, the Germans made every effort to reconstruct the Christian imperium under Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, 1519 to 1555. As under Theodoric. The German continued to dream of that glimpse he had of the imperial system before it sank, one universal, total, holy, eternal, imperial Roman. He refused to accept that it was gone, hating the small group who opposed its revival and despising the great mass who did not care, while regarding himself as the sole defender of values of righteousness, who was prepared to sacrifice anything to restore that dream on earth. Only Charlemagne, who died in 814, came close to achieving that dream. Barbarossa, Charles V, William II, or even Hitler being but pale imitations. After Charlemagne, the state and public authority vanished in the Dark Ages, while society and the church survived. When the state began to revive at the end of the 10th century, it was obviously a separate entity from the church or society. Totalitarian imperium had been permanently broken in the West into two and later many allegiances. During the split in the Dark Ages of the single entity which was simultaneously Holy Roman, Catholic, Universal, and Imperial, the adjectives became displaced from the nouns to leave a universal Catholic Church and a Holy Roman Empire. The former still survives, but the latter was ended by Napoleon in 1806, 1,000 years after Charlemagne. During that 1,000 years, the West developed a pluralistic system in which the individual was the ultimate good and the ultimate philosophical reality. Faced with the need to choose among many conflicting allegiances, Germany was dragged along in the same process, but unwillingly, and continued to yearn for a single allegiance which would be totally absorbing. This desire appeared in many Germanic traits, of which one was a continued love affair with Greece and Rome. Even today, a classical scholar does more of his reading in German than in any other language, although he rarely recognizes that he does so because the appeal of classical culture to the Germans rested on its totalitarian nature, recognized by Germans but generally ignored by Westerners. All the subsequent experiences of the German people, from the failure of Otto the Great in the 10th century to the failure of Hitler in the 20th century, have served to perpetuate and perhaps to intensify the German thirst for the coziness of a totalitarian way of life. This is the key to German national character. In spite of all their talk of heroic behavior, what they have really wanted has been coziness, freedom from the need to make decisions which require an independent, self-reliant individual constantly exposed to the chilling breeze of numerous alternatives. Franz Grillparzer, the Austrian playwright, spoke like a true German when he said a century ago, "The most difficult thing in the world is to make up one's mind. Decision, which requires the evaluation of alternatives, drives a man to individual self-reliance and rationalism, all hateful qualities to Germanism." In spite of these desires of the Germans for the coziness of totalitarian oneness, they have been forced as part, even if a relatively peripheral part, of the West to live otherwise. In spite of these desires of the Germans for the coziness of totalitarian oneness, they have been forced as part of the West to live otherwise. Okay. Even if a relatively peripheral part. This one would make more sense if you switch those around. Looking back, it seemed to Wagner that Germany came closest to its desires in the guild-dominated life of late medieval Augsburg. This is why his only happy opera was placed in that setting. But if Wagner is correct, the situation was achieved only briefly. The shift of world trade from Mediterranean and Baltic to Atlantic destroyed the trans-Germanic commercial basis of German municipal guild life, a fact which Thomas Mann still mourned in our own day. Almost immediately, the spiritual unity of the Germans was shattered by the Protestant Reformation. When it became clear that no degree of violence could restore the old religious unity, the Germans, in the settlement of Augsburg, 1555, came up with a typically German solution. Individuals would be saved from the painful need to make a decision in religious belief by leaving the choice to the prince in each principality. This solution and the almost contemporary reception of Roman law were significant indications of the process by which the German municipalism of the late medieval period was replaced by the Germany of principalities, Länder, of modern times. As a result of the loss of religious unity, the Germans became divided into a Protestant Northeast, increasingly dominated by Hohenzollerns of Brandenburg, Prussia, and a Catholic Southwest, increasingly dominated by the Habsburgs of Austria. Significantly enough, both of these began their dynastic rise as marks, that is, frontier military outpost of Christian Germanism against pagan Slavdom of the East. Even when the Slav East became Christianized and by copying Byzantium obtained a society closer to the Germanic heart's desire than the West, the Germans could neither copy nor join the Slavs because the Slavs, as outlanders from the tribe, were inferior and hardly human beings at all. Even the Poles, who were more fully part of the West than the Germans, were regarded by the Germans as part of the outer darkness of Slavdom, and thus a threat to still non-existent Germanic tribal empire. Germany's misfortunes culminated in the disaster of the 17th century when Richelieu, on behalf of France, used the internal problems of Germany in the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1645, to play off one group against another, ensuring that the Habsburgs would never unify Germany and dooming the Germanies to another 200 years of disunity. Hitler, Bismarck, and even Kaiser William II could well be regarded as Germany's revenge on France for Richelieu, Louis XIV, and Napoleon. In an exposed position in Central Europe, Germany found herself trapped between France, Russia, and the Habsburg dominions, and was unable to deal with her basic problems in her own fashion and on their merits. Accordingly, Germany obtained national unity only late by blood and iron, and never obtained democracy at all. It might be added that she also failed to achieve laissez-faire or liberalism for the same reason. In most countries, democracy was achieved by the middle classes, supported by peasants and workers, in an attack on the monarchy supported by the bureaucracy and landed aristocracy. In Germany, this combination never quite came off because these various groups were reluctant to clash with one another in the face of their threatening neighbors. Instead, Germany's exposed frontiers made it necessary for the various groups to subordinate their mutual antagonisms and obtain unification at the price of sacrifice of democracy, laissez-faire, liberalism, and non-material values. Unification for Germany was achieved in the 19th century not by embracing but by repudiating the typical 19th century values. Starting as a reaction against the assault of Napoleon in 1806 and repudiating the rationalism, cosmopolitanism, the humanitarianism of the Enlightenment. Germany achieved only by the following processes. 1. By strengthening the monarchy and its bureaucracy. 2. By strengthening the permanent professional army. 3. By preserving the landlord class, the Junkers, as a source of personnel for both bureaucracy and army. By strengthening the industrial class through direct and indirect state subsidy, but never giving it a vital voice in state policy. 5. By appeasing the peasants and workers through paternalistic economic and social grants rather than by the extension of political rights, which would allow these groups to assist themselves. All right. The long series of failures by the Germans to obtain the society they wanted served only to intensify their desire for it. They wanted a cozy society with both security and meaning, a totalitarian structure which would be at the same time universal and ultimate, and which would so absorb the individual in its structure that he would never need to make significant decisions for himself. Held in a framework of known, satisfying personal relationships, such as an individual would be safe because he would be surrounded by fellows equally satisfied with their own positions, each feeling important from his membership in the greater whole. Although this social structure was never achieved in Germany and never could be achieved in the view of the dynamic nature of Western civilization in which the Germans were a part, each German over the centuries has tried to create such a situation for himself in his immediate environment, at the minimum in his family or beer garden, or failing that, has created German literature, music, drama, and art as vehicles of his protest at this lack. This desire has been evident in the German's thirst for status, which establishes his relationship with the whole, and for the absolute, which gives unchanging meaning to the whole. The German thirst for status is entirely different from the American desire for status. The American is driven by the desire to get ahead, that is, to change his status. He wants status and status symbols to exist as clear evidence or even measures of the speed with which he is changing his status. The German wants status as a nexus of obvious relationships around himself, so there will never be doubt in anyone's mind where he stands, stationary in the system. He wants status because he dislikes changes, because he abhors the need to make decisions. The American thrives on change, novelty, and decisions. Strangely enough, both react in this opposite fashion for somewhat similar reasons based on the inadequate maturation and integration of the individual's personality. The American seeks change, as the German seeks external fixed relationships as a distraction from the lack of integration, self-sufficiency, and internal resources of the individual himself. The German wants status reflected in obvious external symbols so that his nexus of personal relationships will be clear to everyone he meets, and so that he will be treated accordingly and almost automatically without need for painful decisions. He wants titles, uniforms, nameplates, flags, buttons, anything which will make his position clear to all. In every German organization, be it a business, school, army, church, social club, or family, there are ranks, gradations, and titles. No German could be satisfied with just his name on a calling card or the nameplate of his doorway. His calling card must also have his address, his titles, his educational achievements. The great anthropologist Robert H. Lowy tells of men with 2 doctorate degrees whose nameplates have Professor, Doctor, Doctor so-and-so, for all the world to see their double academic status. The emphasis on minor gradations of rank and class with titles is a reflection of Germanic particularism, just as the verbal insistence on the absolute is a reflection of German universalism, which must give meaning to the system as a whole. In this system, the German feels it necessary to proclaim his position by verbal loudness, which may seem boastful to outsiders, just as his behavior towards his superiors and inferiors in his personal relationships seems to an Englishman to either be fawning or bullying. All of these are acceptable to his fellow Germans, who are as eager to see these indications of his status as he is to show them. All of these reactions, criticized by German thinkers like Kant as craving for precedence and satirized in German literature for the last 2 centuries, have been the essential tissue of the personal relationship which make up German life. The correct superscription on an envelope, we are told, would be Herrn Herfat Professor Dr. Siegfried Harnisch Schäfiger. These pomposities are used in speech as well as in writing and are applied to the individual's wife as well as to himself. Such an emphasis on position, precedence, titles, gradations, and fixed relationships especially up and down, are so typically German that the German is most at home in hierarchical situations such as a military, ecclesiastical, or educational organization, and is often ill at ease in business or politics where status is less easy to establish and make obvious. Such emphasis on position with this kind of nature and such neurological systems, Germans are ill at ease with equality, democracy, individualism, freedom, and other features of modern life. Their neurological systems were a consequence of the coziness of the German childhood, which, contrary to popular impression, was not a condition of misery and personal cruelty as it often is in England, but a warm, affectionate, and externally disciplined situation of secure relationships. After all, Santa Claus and the child-centered Christmas is Germanic. This is the situation the adult German, face to face with what seems an alien world, is constantly seeking to recapture. To the German, this Gemütlichkeit This is, to the German, this is Gemütlichkeit, but to outsiders, it may be suffocating. In any case, it gives rise among adult Germans to two additional traits of German character: the need for external discipline and the quality of egocentricity. The Englishman is disciplined from within, so that he takes his self-discipline embedded in his neurological system with him wherever he goes, even to situations where all the external forms of discipline are lacking. As a consequence, the Englishman is most completely socialized, is the most completely socialized of Europeans, as the Frenchman is the most completely civilized, the Italian the most completely gregarious, or the Spaniard the most completely individualistic. But the Germans, by seeking external discipline, shows his unconscious desire to recapture the externally disciplined world of his childhood. With such discipline, he may be the best behaved of citizens, but without it, he may be a beast. A second notable carryover from childhood to adult German life was egocentricity. The whole world seems to any child to revolve around it, and most societies have provided ways in which the adolescent is disabused of this error. The German leaves childhood so abruptly that he rarely learns this fact of the universe, and spends the rest of his life creating a network of established relationships centering on himself. Since this is his aim in life, he sees no need to make any effort to see anything from any point of view other than his own. The consequence is a most damaging inability to do this. Each class or group is totally unsympathetic to any point of view except the egocentric one of the viewer himself. His union, his company, his composer, his poet, his party, his neighbor are the best, almost the only acceptable examples of the class, and all others must be denigrated. As part of this process, a German usually chooses for himself his favorite flower, musical composition, beer, club, painting, or opera, and sees little value or merit in any other. Yet, at the same time, he insists that his myopic or narrow-angled vision of the universe must be universalized, because no people are more insistent on the role of the absolute or the universal as the framework of their own egocentricity. One deplorable consequence of this has been the social animosities rampant in a Germany which has loudly proclaimed its rigid solidarity. With an individual personality structure such as this, the German was painfully uncomfortable in the totally different, and to him totally unfriendly, world of the 19th century individualism, liberalism, competitive atomism, democratic equality, and self-reliant dynamicism. And the German was doubtably uncomfortable and embittered by 1860 to see the power, wealth, and national unity which these 19th century traits had brought to Britain and France. The late arrival of these achievements, especially national unity and industrialism in Germany, left the average German with a feeling of inferiority in respect to England. Few Germans were willing to compete as individuals with British businessmen. Accordingly, the new unified German government was expected to help German industrialists with tariffs, credit and price and production controls, cheaper labor cost, and such. As a consequence, Germany never had a clearly competitive liberal economy like the Western powers. The failure to achieve democracy was reflected in public law. The German parliament was more of an advisory than a legislative body. The judiciary was not under popular control, and the executive, the chancellor and the cabinet, were responsible to the emperor rather than to the parliament. Moreover, the constitution, because of a peculiar suffrage system, was weighted to give undue importance to Prussia, which was the stronghold of the army, the landlords, the bureaucracy, and the industrialists. Within Prussia, the elections were weighted to give undue influence to these same groups. Above all, the army was subject to no democratic or even governmental control, but was dominated by the Prussian officers' corps, whose members were recruited by regimental election. This officers' corps thus came to resemble a fraternity rather than an administrative or professional organization. By 1890, when he retired from office, Bismarck had built up an unstable balance of forces within Germany to the unstable balance of powers which he had established in Europe as a whole. His cynical and materialistic view of human motivations had driven all idealistic and humanitarian forces from the German political scene and had remodeled the political parties almost completely into economic and social pressure groups, which he played off one against another. The chief of these forces were the landlords, Conservative Party, the Industrialist, National Liberal Party, the Catholics, Center Party, and the Workers' Social Democratic Party. In addition, the army and the bureaucracy were expected to be politically neutral, but they did not hesitate to exert pressures on the government without the intermediary of any political party. Thus, there existed a precarious and dangerous balance of forces which only a genius could manipulate. Bismarck was followed by no genius. The Kaiser, William II, 1888 to 1918, was an incapable neurotic, and the system of recruitment to government service was such as to exclude any but mediocrities. As a result, the precarious structure left by Bismarck was not managed but was merely hidden from public view by a facade of nationalistic, anti-foreign, anti-Semitic, imperialistic, and chauvinistic propaganda of which the emperor was the center. The dichotomy in Germany between appearance and reality, between propaganda and structure, between economic prosperity and political and social weakness was put to the test in World War I and failed completely. The events of 1914 to 1919 revealed that Germany was not a democracy in which all men were legally equal. Instead, the ruling groups formed some strange animal lording it over a host of lesser animals. Interesting sentence. In this strange creature, the monarchy represented the body, which was supported by four legs: the army, the landlords, the bureaucracy, and the industrialists. This glimpse of reality was not welcome to any important group in Germany, with the result that it was covered over almost at once by another misleading facade. The revolution of 1918 was not really a revolution at all because it did not radically change this situation. It removed the monarchy, but it left the quartet of legs. This quartet was not the creation of a moment, rather, it was the result of a long process of development whose last stages were reached only in the 20th century. In these last stages, the industrialists were adopted into the ruling clique by conscious act of agreement. These acts culminated in the years 1898 to 1905 in a deal by which the Junkers accepted the industrialist navy building program, which they detested, in return for the industrialist acceptance of the Junkers' high tariff on grains. The Junkers were anti-navy because they, with a few with their few numbers and close alliance with the army, were opposed to any venture into the fields of colonialism or overseas imperialism, and were determined not to jeopardize Germany's continental position by alienating England. In fact, the policy of the Junkers was not only a continental one. On the continent, it was Klein Deutsch. This expression meant that they were not eager to include the Germans of Austria within Germany because such an increment of Germans would dilute the power of a small group of Junkers inside Germany. Oh, Klein means small. So it's like a small Germany. Instead, the Junkers would have preferred to annex the non-German areas to the east in order to obtain additional land and a supply of cheap Slav agricultural labor. The Junkers wanted agricultural tariffs to rise the prices of their crops, especially rye and latter sugar beets. The industrialists objected to tariffs on food because high food prices made necessary high wages, which they opposed. On the other hand, the industrialists wanted high industrial prices on a market for the products of heavy industry. The former they obtained by the creation of cartels after 1888. The latter they obtained by the naval building program and armaments expansion after 1898. The Junkers agreed to these only in return for a tariff on food, which eventually, through import certificates, became a subsidy for growing rye. This alliance, of which Below was the creator, was agreed upon in May 1900 and consummated in December 1902. The tariff of 1902, which gave Germany one of the most protected agricultures in the world, was the price paid by industry for the Navy Bill of 1900, and symbolically enough, could be passed through the Reichstag only after the rules of procedure were violated to gag the opposition. The quartet was not conservative, but potentially at least revolutionary reactionaries. This is true, at least of the landlords and industrialists, somewhat less true of the bureaucracy, and least true of the army. The landlords were revolutionary because they were driven to desperation by the persistent agricultural crisis, which made it difficult for a high-cost area like Eastern Germany to compete with a low-cost area like the Ukraine or a high-productivity areas like Canada, Argentina, or the United States. Even in isolated Germany, they had difficulty in keeping down the wages of German agricultural labor or obtaining agricultural credit. The former problem rose from the need to compete with the industrial wages of West Germany. The credit problem rose because of the epidemic lack of capital in Germany, the need to compete with industry for the available supply of capital, and the impossibility of raising capital by mortgages where estates were entailed. As a result of these influences, the landlords, overburdened with debts, in great jeopardy from any price decline, and importers of unorganized Slav labor, dreamed of conquest of land and labor in Eastern Europe. The industrialists were in a similar plight, caught between the high wages of unionized German labor and the limited market for industrial products. To increase the supply of both labor and markets, they hoped for an active foreign policy which would bring into one unit a pan-German bloc, if not a Middle Europa. The bureaucracy, for ideological, especially nationalist reasons, shared these dreams of conquest. Only the army hung back under the influence of the Junkers, who saw how easily they, as a limited political and social power, could be overwhelmed in a Middle Europe or even a Pan-Germania. Accordingly, the Prussian officers' corps had little interest in these Germanic dreams and looked with favor on conquest of the Slav areas only if this could be accomplished without undue expansion of the army itself. Okay, so that's page 418. Now we're on the Weimar Republic. The essence of German history from 1918 to 1933 can be found in the statement, "There was no revolution in 1918. For there to have been a revolution, it would have been necessary to liquidate the quartet, or at least subject them to democratic control." The quartet represented the real power in German society because they represented the forces of public order, army and bureaucracy, and of economic production, landlords and industrialists. Even without a liquidation of this quartet, it might have been possible for democracy to function in the intricacies between them if they had quarreled amongst themselves. They did not quarrel because they had an esprit de corps bred by years of service to a common system, the monarchy, and because, in many cases, the same individuals were to be found in two or even more of the four groups. Franz von Papen, for example, was a Westphalian noble, a colonel in the army, an ambassador, and a man with extensive industrial holdings, derived from his wife in Saarland. Although there was no revolution, that is, no real shift in control of power in Germany in 1919, there was a legal change. In law, a democratic system was set up. As a result, by the late 1920s, there had appeared an obvious discrepancy between law and fact, the regime, according to the law, being controlled by the people, while in fact it was controlled by the quartet. The reasons for this situation are important. The quartet, with the monarchy, made the war of 1914 to 1918 were incapable of winning it. As a result, they were completely discredited and deserted by the soldiers and workers. Thus, the masses of the people completely renounced the old system in November 1918. The quartet, however, was not liquidated for several reasons. 1. They were able to place the blame for the disaster on the monarchy and jettison this to save themselves. 2. Most Germans accepted this as an adequate revolution. 3. The Germans hesitated to make a real revolution for fear it would lead to an invasion of Germany by the French, the Poles, or others. 4. Many Germans were satisfied with the creation of government, which was democratic in form and made little effort to examine the underlying reality. 5. The only political party capable of directing a real revolution was the Social Democrats, who had opposed the quartet system and the war itself, at least in theory, but this party was incapable of doing anything in the crisis of 1918 because it was hopelessly divided into doctrinary cliques, was horrified at the danger of Soviet Bolshevism, and was satisfied that order, trade unionism, and a democratic regime were more important than Stalinism, humanitarian welfare, or consistency between theory and action. Before 1914, there were two parties which stood outside the quartet system, the Social Democrats and the Center Catholic Party. The former was doctrinary in its attitude, being anti-capitalist, pledged to the International Brotherhood of Labor, pacifist, democratic, and Marxist in an evolutionary but not revolutionary sense. The Center Party, like the Catholics, who made it up, came from all levels of society and all shades of ideology, but in practice were frequently opposed to the quartet on specific issues. These two opposition parties underwent considerable change during the war. The Social Democrats always opposed the war in theory, but supported it on patriotic grounds by voting for credits to finance the war. Its minute left wing refused to support the war even in this fashion as early as 1914. This extremist group, under Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, became known as the Spartacist Union, and after 1919 as the Communists. These extremists wanted an immediate and complete socialist revolution with a Soviet form of government. More moderate than the Spartacists was another group calling itself Independent Socialist. These voted war credits until 1917, when they refused to continue to do so and broke from the Democratic Socialist Party. The rest of the Social Democrats supposed the war. The rest of the Social Democrats supported the war and the old monarchical system until November 1918, in fact, but in theory embraced an extreme type of evolutionary socialism. The Center Party was aggressive and nationalist until 1917, when it became pacifist. Wait, I think evolutionary socialism means kind of like Fabian socialism, where they're like, instead of like having a revolution, they just take over by getting elected into the government slowly. Under Matthias Erzberger, it allied with the Social Democrats to push through the Reichstag Peace Revolution of July 1917. The position of these various groups on the issue of aggressive nationalism was sharply revealed in the voting to ratify the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, imposed by the militarist Junkers and industrialists on a prostrate Russia. The Center Party voted to ratify. The Social Democrats abstained from voting. The Democrats voted no. The revolution of November 1918 would have been a real revolution, except for the opposition of the Social Democrats and the Center Party, for the Quartet in the crucial days of November and December 1918 were discouraged, discredited, and helpless. Outside the Quartet itself, there was, at the time and even later, only two small groups which could possibly have been used by the Quartet as rallying points, about which could have been formed some mass support for the Quartet. These two small groups were indiscriminate nationalists and mercenaries. The indiscriminate nationalists were those men, like Hitler, who were not able to distinguish between the German nation and the old monarchical system. These persons, because of their loyalty to the nation, were eager to rally to the support of the Quartet, which they regarded as identical with the nation. The mercenaries were a larger group who had no particular loyalty to anyone or to any ideas, but were willing to serve any group which could pay for such service. The only groups able to pay were two of the Quartet, the officer corps and the industrialists, who organized many mercenaries into reactionary armed bands or free corps in 1918 to 1923. Instead of working for a revolution in 1918 to 1919, the two parties which dominated the situation, the Social Democrats and the centrists, did all they could to prevent a revolution. They not only left the Quartet in their positions of responsibility and power, the landlords on their estates, the officers in their commands, the industrialists in control of their factories, and the bureaucracy in control of the police, the courts, and the administration, but they increased the influence of these groups because the actions of the Quartet were not restrained under the Republic by the sense of honor or loyalty to the system which had restrained the use of their power under the monarchy. Some of these sentences are ridiculous. As early as November 10, 1918, Friedrich Ebert, chief figure of the Social Democrat Party, made an agreement with the officer corps in which he promised not to use the power of the new government to democratize the army if the officers would support the new government against the threat of the independents and the Spartakists to establish the Soviet system. As a consequence of this agreement, Ebert kept a private telephone line from his office in the Chancellery to General Wilhelm Groner's office at the Army's headquarters and consulted with the Army on many critical political issues. As another consequence, Ebert and his masters of war, Gustav Noske, also a social democrat, used the army under its old monarchist officers to destroy the workers and radicals who sought to challenge the existing situation. This was done in Berlin, December 1918, in January 1919, and again in March 1919, and in other cities at other times. In these assaults, the army had the pleasure of killing several thousand of the detested radicals. A somewhat similar anti-revolutionary agreement was made between heavy industry and the socialist trade unions on November 11, 1918. On that day, Hugo Steins, Albert Vogler, and Alfred Hugenberg, representing industry, and Karl Liegen, Otto Hue, and Hermann Mueller, representing the unions, signed an agreement to support each other in order to keep the factories functioning. Although this agreement was justified on opportunist grounds, it clearly showed the so-called socialists were not interested in economic or social reform, but were merely interested in the narrow trade union objectives of wages, hours, and working conditions. It was this narrow range of interest which ultimately destroyed the average German's faith in the socialists or their unions. The history of the period from 1918 to 1933 cannot be understood without some knowledge of the chief political parties. There were almost 40 parties, but only 7 or 8 were important. These were from the extreme left to extreme right as follows: the Spartakist Union, or Communist KPD, the Independent Socialist USPD, the Social Democrats SPD, Democratic Center, including Bavarian People's Party, the Nationalist, and the Racist, including the Nazis. Of these parties, only the Democrats had any sincere and consistent belief in the Democratic Republic. On the other hand, the Communist, Independents, and many of the Social Democrats on the left, as well as the Racist, Nationalist, and many of the People's Party on the right, were adverse to the Republic, or at best ambivalent. The Catholic Center Party, being formed on a religious rather than on a social basis, had members from all areas of the political and social spectrum. The political history of Germany, from the armistice of 1918 to the arrival of Hitler to the chancellorship in Germany in January 1933, can be divided into 3 periods. Thus, the period of turmoil, 1918 to 1924, period of fulfillment, 1924 to 1930, the period of disintegration, 1930 to 1933. During this span of over 14 years, there were 8 elections, in none of which In none of which did a single party obtain a majority of the seats in the Reichstag. Accordingly, every German cabinet of the period was a coalition. The following table gives the results of these 8 elections. All right, he's got a table on page 422. On the basis of these elections, Germany had 20 major cabinet changes from 1919 to 1933. Generally, these cabinets were constructed about the center and Democratic parties, with the addition of representatives from either the Social Democrats or the People's Party. On only two occasions, Gustav Stresemann in 1923 and Hermann Mueller in 1928 to 1930, was it possible to obtain a cabinet broad enough to include all four of these parties. Moreover, the second of these broad front cabinets was the only cabinet after 1923 to include the Socialists and the only cabinet after 1925 which did not include the Nationalists. This indicates clearly the drift to the right in the German government after the resignation of Joseph Rith in November 1922. This drift, as we shall see, was delayed by only two influences: the need for foreign loans and political concessions from the Western powers, and the recognition that both of these could be obtained better by a government which seemed to be Republican and Democratic in inclination than by a government which was obviously hand in glove with the Quartet. At the end of the war in 1918, the Socialists were in control, not because the Germans were socialistic, for the party was not really socialist, but because this was the only party which had been traditionally in opposition to the imperial system. A committee of 6 men was set up, 3 from the Democratic Socialist, Ebert, Philipp Schneidmann, and Otto Landsberg, and 3 from the Independent Socialist, Hugo Haas, William Dittmann, and Emil Barth. Wilhelm Dittmann. This group ruled as a sort of combined emperor and chancellor and had the regular secretaries of the state as their subordinates. These men did nothing to consolidate the republic or democracy and were opposed to any efforts to take any steps towards socialism. They even refused to nationalize the coal industry, something which was generally expected. Instead, they wasted the opportunity by busying themselves with typical trade union problems such as the 8-hour day, November 12, 1918, and collective bargaining methods, December 23, 1918. The critical problem was the form of government, with the choice resting between workers' and peasants' councils, Soviets, already widely established, and a national assembly to set up an ordinary parliamentary system. The socialist group preferred the latter and were willing to use the regular army to enforce this choice. On the basis of a counter-revolutionary agreement, On this basis, a counter-revolutionary agreement was made between Ebert and the General Staff. As a consequence of this agreement, the army attacked a Spartacist parade in Berlin on December 6, 1918, and liquidated the rebellious People's Naval Division on December 24, 1918. In protest at this violence, the 3 independent members of the government resigned. Their example was followed by other independents throughout Germany, with the exception of Kurt Eisner in Munich. The next day, the Spartakists formed the German Communist Party with a non-revolutionary program. Their declaration read, in part, "The Spartakist Union will never assume governmental power except in response to the plain and unmistakable wish of the great majority of the proletarian masses in Germany, and only as a result of a definite agreement of these masses with the aims and methods of the Spartakist Union." This pious expression, however, was the program of the leaders. The masses of the new party, and possibly the members of the independent socialist group as well, were enraged at the conservatism of the Social Democrats and began to get out of hand. The issue was joined on the question of councils versus National Assembly. The government, under Nosuke's direction, used regular troops in a bloody suppression of the left, January 5th to the 15th, ending up with the murder of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the communist leaders. The result was exactly as the quartet wanted. The communist and many non-communist workers were permanently alienated from the socialist and from the parliamentary republic. The Communist Party, deprived of leaders of its own, became a tool of Russian communism. As a result of this repression, the army was able to disarm the workers at the very moment when it was beginning to arm reactionary private bands, free corps of the right. Both of these developments were encouraged by Ebert and Noske. Only in Bavaria was the alienation of communists and socialists and the disarmament of the former not carried out. Kurt Eisner, the independent socialist minister-president in Munich, prevented it. Accordingly, Eisner was murdered by Count Anton von Acro-Valley on February 21, 1919. When the workers of Munich revolted, they were crushed by a combination of regular army and free corps amid scenes of horrible violence from both sides. Eisner was replaced as premier by a social democrat, Adolf Hoffmann. Hoffmann, on the night of March 13, 1920, was thrown out by a military coup which replaced him by a government of the right under Gustav von Kahr. In the meantime, the National Assembly, elected on June 19, 1919, drew up a parliamentary constitution under the guidance of Professor Hugo Preuss. This constitution provided for a president elected for 7 years to be the head of state, a bicameral legislator, and a cabinet responsible to the lower house of the legislature. The upper house, or Reichstag, consisted of representatives of 18 German states and had, in legislative matters, a suspensive veto which could be overcome by a 2/3 vote of the lower chamber. This lower chamber, or Reichstag, had 608 members, elected by a system of proportional representation on a party basis. The head of the government, to whom the president gave a mandate to form a cabinet, was called the chancellor. The chief weakness of the Constitution were the provisions for proportional representation and other provisions by Articles 25 and 48, which allowed the president to suspend constitutional guarantees and rule by decree in periods of national emergency. As early as 1925, the parties of the right were planning to destroy the Republic by use of these powers. So basically, they had martial law written into their constitution, and then they were trying to activate it so that they can become dictators. A direct challenge to the Republic from the right came in March 1920 when Captain Ehrhard's brigade of the Free Corps marched into Berlin, forced the government to flee to Dresden, and set up a government under Wolfgang Kapp, an ultranationalist. Kapp was supported by the army commander in the Berlin area, Baron Walter von Lüttwitz, who became Reichswehr minister in Kapp's government. Since General Hans von Sicht, chief of staff, refused to support the legal government, it was helpless, and was saved only by a general strike of the workers in Berlin and a great proletarian rising in the industrial regions of Western Germany. The Kapp government was unable to function and collapsed, while the army proceeded to violate the territorial disarmament clauses of the Treaty of Versailles by invading the Ruhr in order to crush the workers' uprising in that area. Secht was rewarded for his non-cooperation by being appointed commander-in-chief in May 1920. As a consequence of these disturbances, the general election of July 1920 went against the Weimar Coalition. A new government came in which was completely middle class in its alignment, the socialists of the Weimar Coalition being replaced by the party of big business, the German People's Party. Noske was replaced as Reichswehr minister by Otto Gessler, a willing tool of the officers' corps. Gessler, who held this critical position in March 1920 to January 1928, made no effort to subject the army to democratic or even civilian control, but cooperated in every way with secret efforts to evade the disarmament provisions of the peace treaties. German armament factories were moved to Turkey, Russia, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Switzerland. German officers were drilled in prohibited weapons in Russia and China. Inside Germany, secret armaments were prepared on a considerable scale, and troops in excess of the treaty limits were organized in a Black Reichswehr, which was supported by secret funds of the regular Reichswehr. The Reichstag had no control over either organization. When the Western powers in 1920 demanded that the Free Corps be disbanded, these groups went underground and formed a parallel organization to the Black Reichswehr, being supplied with protection, funds, information, and arms from the Reichswehr and conservatives. In return, the Free Corps engaged in large-scale conspiracy and murder on behalf of the conservatives. According to the Times of London, the Free Corps murdered 400 victims of the left and center in 1 year. The middle-class cabinet of Konstantin Fehrenbach resigned on May 4, 1921, and allowed the Weimar coalition of socialists, Democrats, and center to take office to receive the reparations ultimatum of the Allied governments on May 5th. Thus, the democratic regime was further discredited in the eyes of Germans as an instrument of weakness, hardship, and shame. As soon as the job was done, the socialists were replaced by the People's Party, and the Rith cabinet was succeeded by a purely middle-class government under Wilhelm Kuno, general manager of the Hamburg American Steamship Line. It was this government which managed the hyperinflation of 1923 and the passive resistance against the French forces in the Ruhr. The inflation, which was a great benefit to the quartet, destroyed the economic position of the middle classes and lower classes and permanently alienated them from the Republic. The Kuno government was ended by a deal between Stresemann and the socialists. The former, on behalf of the People's Party, which had hitherto been resolutely anti-Republican, accepted the Republic. The socialists agreed to support a Stresemann cabinet, and a broad coalition was formed for a policy of fulfillment of the Treaty of Versailles. This ended the period of turmoil, August 1923. All right, I think I'll stop reading there. I'm on page 426. So the next, it's not like a next section, but it seems like they're in starting the period of fulfillment now. So that's I gotta be honest, that section was written kind of like confusingly, like all this parenthetical like sentences are ridiculous to read. I mean, reading him like to yourself, it makes complete sense, but trying to read it out loud, this isn't really like a poetry book for sure. But like he was saying, it seems like, you know, there's a lot of historical precedent for the way that people groups operate in the modern day, and it's like a evolution, so to speak, of like a cultural ideas that go back and that are rooted in, more primitive times, you can say, or past times, historical times, right? And these things do affect us in the future, but we also have to understand that like we have the ability to change these things, and we can't just the past is why we're here today, but we also can't let the past control what we're going to do in the future. And I think that this kind of stuff is a good example of that, where we can learn from other people's mistakes and stuff, or other countries' mistakes in this case. But yeah, we'll see what the next section looks like tomorrow. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this. So have a good day and peace.